opiate addiction is clearly something that's gone completely off the rails, and it partly is a result of an unintended consequence of trying to make opiates more difficult to get to. And what's ended up happening is actually caused an explosion, something that I don't think any of us really anticipated seeing. We asked the drug companies to make pills harder to crush, and they did. And the consequences, we ended up with pushing people to other drugs, including a reemergence of heroin addiction, which is really kind of scary. I think the state can do a lot to be more supportive on attacking not just opiate addiction, but drug addiction as well. Our systems in this state are really not as robust as they could be in getting people into programs that allow them to get the kind of treatment they need, whether it's drugs or alcohol, also mental health too. But we're not, our history has been that we're really not very good at that, and we've been slow to respond. So I think it would make a lot of sense for the state to step up and say, well, let's look at how we can begin there. Is how do we get to people sooner so they have an opportunity to get to treatment faster and more effectively. I was just reading an article about 2 weeks ago that was refuting the whole idea of the tough love approach. That drug addiction is really mostly an issue of individual choice. And so he did an experiment with rats where he duplicated an experiment that put 2 bottles of water. One was just plain water and one was laced with heroin. Nothing else in the cage. You can pretty much guess what happened. That rat got hooked on the heroin, drank itself to death, and died right there. But his question was, is that really the way addiction works in the real world? So instead what he did was he created what he called a rat paradise, a cage where there were other rats, where there was lots of stimulation and other things to choose from, put the same 2 bottles in there. And in those situations, the rats chose to avoid the drug-laced water and go with the water instead, implying, and his point was, and I think it's a good one, that environment matters a lot. Where people are, what their particular situation is, makes an enormous difference. If you look at folks who tend to get addicted to drugs, in a lot of cases they're lacking the support systems that most of the rest of us have. That's not true of everyone. I can think of some specific stories that I've heard about good kids in very good families who've gotten hooked on drugs and had an awful time, and that does happen. And we can do better there as well. But for a majority of the time, my belief is that in a lot of cases, those folks who are choosing to self-medicate, which is in a lot of cases where it starts, are doing so because they lack the social structures to stay out of those things in the first place, and the social structures to get them back out once they step in.
What kind of explain how you would envision a preventative social structure. Define that.
Well, I'm looking for things that would strengthen families, reduce poverty, address our homeless issue. I see the drug problem as a system of a or not a system, of a symptom of a much larger system, of a system that's broken. So if we do a better job of making sure that families are well supported, for example, look at out on the peninsula, our church and many others are involved in something called Backpack for Kids. There are a high number of kids out on the peninsula who just don't get enough to eat. So we send them home on the weekend with a backpack, and otherwise they wouldn't eat. Well, that's great, but couldn't we do that through our government? Couldn't we support that instead of relying on volunteers to step into the breach where we as a society have failed? Can't we provide those kind of support so that those kids get the kind of nutrition support that they need so they can do that? So that's just a tip of the iceberg, the kinds of things I'm talking about. More support for families, more support for folks who find themselves in a homeless situation, even here where they get themselves priced out of an apartment. You know that the costs are going way up, and suddenly people who are doing okay, they have one minor catastrophe, a car that breaks down, and suddenly they don't have enough money, and they find themselves homeless.
Yeah, that was one of our things on the list. We'll definitely get the homelessness and mental illness. I'm going to ask about that one too, because I think.
Yeah, so I guess my point is I see them all as very linked.
Yeah, let me ask one more, just because you brought up families, and it's funny, we just happened to be talking about this in the lobby. In addition to what you just described as kind of addressing a financial need, there's also a sociological need, let's say, or something like that, to make sure we keep families intact. What should the state's role be in doing that? How can government address something like that?
Well, you know, I started off my career as a teacher, and it was always frustrating to me to run across kids. I was in high school, so by the time I got there, some of the kids who were really in need didn't get that far. But it was frustrating to me to see the number of kids who were struggling to get through the system, who were lacking support from families. And you know, we've been relying on public education to try to solve those problems for us for a long, long time. We've put a lot on the schools to try to solve social problems for us. And frankly, it's really not in their it's in their interest to address those problems, because those kids are there and they have those real issues.
They don't have any choice. They're there.
That's right. And so that, you know, the schools are really forced to deal with them. My point is, I'd like to see a more robust social system that's out there. Larry Iyer, who runs the system here in Bremerton, is a friend of mine. I used to play basketball with him back in the Y when we both had knees that were still able to carry us up and down the basketball court. And you know, I had a chance to tour his facility and meet his program directors. And they're doing some great work. But like a lot of other organizations that are doing those, they're forced to operate on a shoestring. We relegate those kind of services as kind of low-tier support things on a state budget.
I'm sorry, you're talking about Larry with, is this?
Kitsap Community Resources.
Kitsap Community Resources over on Warren Avenue. Sorry, I should have been more specific. Yeah, so I mean, they're doing fantastic work, but they got to dig and scratch to find funding to keep their programs going. And my point is, I think that's a legitimate function of government, is to step into the breach and provide opportunities for people to move from socioeconomic situations that are really tough to something that's better.
And when you talk about the services that you're highlighting in KCR, you mean things like counseling, that kind of stuff? Counseling,
you know, even more basic things. That one of the programs that I thought was really cool is they've got a coaching program for folks who are starting new businesses. So these are people who are trying to work, you know, pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, start their own businesses, but they really don't have any background at all about how to get a business off the ground, let alone run it and make it successful. So here they have resources that show them how to do that on a very personal basis. So I love that. I love that whole concept.
Getting deeper into
and at a very personal level. So it's not some huge bureaucracy that is tough to penetrate. I mean, it's hard to get into the drug programs, for example.
So these are kind of county agencies, locally based agencies. In your conversation with Larry, what can the legislature do for those?
Well, I think we can talk about providing a more consistent basis of funding for them from the state level. You know, 90% of the money in this state goes for education's the biggest chunk, of course. Public safety is another, and then transportation is another big chunk. So, you know, we end up picking up crumbs for these kinds of programs, and I really would like to see more emphasis on those kinds of things. I think that would really help us move out of the devastation that occurred in 2008 when the economy collapsed and threw a lot of people into a difficult situation. I see a lot more people, maybe this was there before and I just didn't notice it, but like getting off of Highway 16 and finding a homeless person there begging for a job or handouts. I don't remember seeing that 10 years ago. Maybe it was there, but I see it more frequently now.
No. What do you think the state's role is?
You know, I've read about that. You talk about the Utah model.
Correct.
And from what I've read and what I've listened to on the radio, I love their approach. I think it makes terrific sense. And it gets back to the approach that I was talking about earlier about drug addiction. If you put people in an environment where they have a chance to succeed, to get out of that lifestyle, or to choose not to get into it in the first place, you've got a much better chance of reaching them sooner, and providing an opportunity for them to succeed. So I'm advocating that with homelessness we do the same thing. Their model is provide housing first, and then help them, once you get them stabilized in housing, help them deal with their issues.
Do you like it on the county level, or do you think the state, and the reason I asked that is Seattle, and what Seattle's doing as a city. They're investing a lot of money, they're appointing this czar.
Right.
Is that an approach to do it locally like that, or would you think there's more?
I'd rather see a statewide problem, because my wife and I lived for 5 years in Colville, Washington. They're a rural area north of Spokane. There are lots of other rural areas. Certainly a lot of Kitsap County is rural. It's a lot tougher to pull off a model like that Seattle can do in these rural areas, or I think about the Key Peninsula. There's some folks doing some tremendous work out there, but man, it's an uphill battle. So I'd like to see the state get involved with that. I like the fact that in Utah, it was the state that was leading that whole effort. That makes sense to me.
Seattle was not a very good model. It put tens of millions of dollars in their homeless problem. They've got more homeless now than they've ever had.
Yeah, their results have not been very stellar. So yeah, you're right. It's not a model that we ought to really be following.
It's a model not to follow.
Right. I would agree.
Do you think it's something that the private sector can do?
Private sector can always have some input there. They have for a long time. Again, I gave my church as an example of being involved in the Backpack for Kids.
I don't even mean that. I mean, like developers.
I see what you're saying. Talking about private developers.
Yeah.
Developers are in business to make, they're building homes, they want to make money. One of the things I've noticed about building development is that it usually falls to governments, usually this tends to be either cities or counties, to provide tax incentives to get developers to put in low-income housing or affordable housing to make that work. And that is, I think, an appropriate role for government, is to provide those incentives. After all, anybody who's building homes, they're just trying to make a living too. So what would you build? Would you build something that you have a good chance to make a profit, or would you be building things where it's much tougher? And the lower income housing developments are tougher to make money. So unless we provide incentives, unless we include them, I like the idea of building in a mix of housing, so it's not, we're not segregating. It's like not the New York City model where you build these monstrosities where you essentially warehouse poor people. I hate that kind of idea. I much prefer the idea of integrating, so we have a variety of housing that's available all in the same area. So those kinds of incentives, I think, make sense.
Do you think it's a problem with the regulation? In other words, if we just loosen the regulation in terms of zoning or
no, I think it's appropriate for governments to be pretty robust about zoning. What we can do better, I think, frankly, is smooth out the application processes, the permitting processes. We really make it difficult.
Streamline.
Oh, I ran, and I was concerned about this, and I ran across a report that was written, I think, I don't know, it was 5 or 10 years ago, with a whole list of solutions specifically for that problem that, as I read through them, made perfect sense. And they were coming from a study group reporting to the legislature. They simply haven't been implemented. And I'm not sure I know why, other than just institutional.
Give me an example of one that maybe in Port Orchard would fit.
Well, for example, the best idea I thought was providing a single portal. So you go online, you want to build a project, and you get into the project. You have a single portal. You enter your basic information, so you're not having to do it over and over and over again for each spot. And then the system directs you through the process and gets you on a schedule so you can get through the permitting process more quickly and get up and running, and so that you can begin to be successful. So we could do that at the state level, we could do it at the county level, we could do it at the city level, but I'd start at the state level because I think the state's frankly the worst.
What do you think about the shoreline management, the growth management act?
That's a law that's been around for quite a while now. I think the conception makes complete sense because we need to be careful about our environment. encouraging growth in urban areas, you know, saying, hey, this is the place where we really want people, we want to preserve open spaces in other places, makes complete sense. At this point, this many years down the road, it makes sense for us to go back and say, you know, there are a number of tweaks that we can make to this thing. The state has actually been pretty flexible, as far as I can see, in implementation from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and that in itself has created some confusion about what's okay and what's not okay. So I'd like the legislature to go back, revisit that law, fine-tune it a little bit, and get back out, and, you know, based on what we've actually learned, based on the science, if that makes sense.
Why not?
I would not, because the Republican caucus has brought that forward, and frankly, I think it is very clever marketing or framing of the issue. And what they seem to be implying is that we'll fund education, but maybe not others, or we need to cut elsewhere, or, as I've been hearing from them in debates, well, we'll fund education first, but we want to be able to track where every dollar goes. I'm not terribly concerned about tracking. It sort of is insulting, I think, both to local school boards and to superintendents, that they're not spending their money well. The fact is, we run our schools on a shoestring. 80% of the money in any district plus is spent on people, because education is a people business. Education is hands-on. It's a service. So you know, it's not a business. So we need, in my view, to fully fund education. I agree with the McCleary decision. I mean, essentially what they were saying is, we have failed, according to our Constitution, to meet our obligation to provide opportunities for kids everywhere in the state. That's simply not true. That's basically what the court ruled. So that means that if you're in a wealthy district right now, you do pretty well, but if you're in some place that is struggling, your kid doesn't have the same kind of opportunities. So we've got to step up and do that. I think that needs to remain one of the ideas that the fund education first is create a separate budget. I disagree with that. I think it needs to remain the central part of our main budget, our central budget, and we need to meet that obligation. Now, having said that, I'm really concerned, because we're talking about a $6 to $8 billion bill on a $39 billion biannual budget currently, and that's a huge number. That's a big percentage jump. Now, yeah, that means we reduce local property taxes that now go to levies, which is good for people, particularly for retirees who are struggling to pay that, or may support schools but vote against a levy or a bond issue because they can't afford the tax.
You're talking about the property tax,
property
the
tax.
levy equalization swap.
Yes, yes. So that's great, but my concern is where is that $6 to $8 billion going to come from? And you know that we have the most...
You don't believe that scenario addresses what can be found? Am I understanding you correctly?
What doesn't address?
That idea to do the property tax levy swap, so it's statewide, not local.
You know, I'm not a big fan of levies. I think they're silly.
Local levies.
Yes. And levy swap is a step in the right direction. At least it levels the playing field. So, you know, here's where I would depart from the governor who's opposed to it. I would support it. But frankly, I'd really rather find another means of funding that. Well, that's a tough one, because the way our tax system is set up in this state, I already said it's the most progressive in the country, it's because we're highly dependent on sales tax. And so those taxes and fees tend to fall most heavily on the poorest among us. In fact, if you look at income in Washington by bands, the percentage that you pay in tax, state, and I'm talking just state, taxes and fees, is highest at the bottom and lowest at the top. And it's a straight line. It's about 17% at the bottom. It's about 2.5% at the top. So we have in my view, a tax system that is fundamentally flawed, that is both morally unjust because we're putting a larger burden on people who can least afford it, and fiscally, frankly, stupid. It doesn't make any sense to go out and ask for people who don't have money in the first place to pay for more. So we can't go, my point is this, we can't go to our sales tax system or our current tax system and say, well, we just need to raise these taxes so we can cover that $6 to $8 billion. Can't be done.
So you're against the state income tax
I'm
at
against.
the same time. So where's the money going to come from?
That's a great question. And it's one I don't have a clear answer to. The governor last time suggested a couple things that make sense and they're a movement in the right direction. One is closing loopholes. You know, there's some stuff on there that are silly, that don't make any sense. Some frankly belong there. I'm talking about tax exemptions that exist for various businesses. But even if we closed them all right now, we'd only get somewhere between $300 and $500 million.
Well, some are saying that we get $5 billion if we close the tax.
I don't believe it. I don't believe it. I think it's much lower than that. So while I would, yeah, sure, let's go ahead and close some of those exemptions that don't make sense anymore, that are outdated. What do we have? Hundreds of those things that are on the books. Some make sense. You know, some we need, that we want there. We were talking about incentives earlier for building low-income housing. If we had an exemption on the book for that would make sense. But others don't. So I would go there. I agree with the governor that we could look at a high-income capital gains tax. This would be for non-W-2 income, not earned income, but for folks who are making a lot of income on investments over a certain threshold. I don't know what threshold he suggested, but I think it was in the $500,000 range, so there wouldn't be. Is that what it was?
That's what I remember.
That's what I remember too. I could be wrong about it, but so that's a place where we can begin to close the loop. And there are others, but you know, as I look at our tax code, we simply systemically don't ask folks who are doing better, frankly, in our economy to carry their fair share. So I'd be looking at, well, how can we do that? And you're right, income tax is off the table.
What about with corporations? Is there a better way to tax corporations at the state level?
Well, it's a good question. We've given, for example, Boeing, our largest employer here, billions of dollars of tax breaks, really on a promise. The reason we do it as a state is we want to keep them here. We want to keep them happy. We want to keep the jobs here. I would argue that they have frequently and systematically broken that promise. So I wouldn't be adverse at all to going back to the Boeings of the world and saying, you know, we'd like some of that back. Now, I'm not naive or stupid. You don't eliminate them entirely, because then they, you know, do pick up their game and go home, go somewhere else. I certainly don't want to encourage that. I'd like to make sure they stay in the state. But honestly, I don't think they're carrying their fair share. Hello?
Sorry, Jim Campbell.
Hi, Jim.
Let's go back to the education question, because we kind of talked about the funding side of it a little bit, but let's talk about the policy side and that definition of basic education. Do you agree with what that task force is kind of framing out as far as what should be paid for? Is there anything that you think, boy, we're putting too much in there and we make it unaffordable? Or on the other side, do you think, you know, we're missing a piece that we really need to be including to make sure this is done right?
I think we've been chronically underfunding schools for decades. When I was a senior in high school, Bremerton had a levy that failed, and I was so upset about it, and you know, fired up, 17 years old, that I wanted to lead a protest downtown. My history teacher talked me down, got me not to do that. But at that time, you know, the levy lid was 10%. And the idea of levies in this state initially was to provide extra things that local districts wanted to add to the budget that the state didn't provide. But even at that time, this was 1970, even at that time, levies were in fact covering part of what should have been basic education costs.
Such as?
Salaries and equipment. And in most cases, it's equipment that gets cut.
Yeah, but money is not supposed to go for teacher salaries.
It's not.
Unconstitutional.
It is unconstitutional. But, you know, we're now at a 24% levy cap, depending on where you are. And yes, those are, you know, as I said, about 80% of the budget is for people, it's for teachers and non-certs. So imagine, for example, if you don't pass your levy and you need that 24%. Okay, so you have enough money to pay all your teachers, but you have nothing for the operation, the other 20%. To me, that makes no sense at all.
Do you think the teacher salary should be negotiated statewide?
I do not. I
think that
prefer
local-
that they, yeah, I really like the idea of local accountability, local school boards. I know it could become a little unwieldy if we do provide 100% funding at the state level. One of the arguments is, well, gee, if the state provides that, then they ought to be able to negotiate statewide as well. But it really doesn't take into account some significant differences in cost of living and other circumstances from district to district to district. So I'd prefer that we keep that both in the hands of our local school boards and of the unions in those areas too.
From your perspective as a teacher, what would be most helpful for the performance of schools?
Let them
Okay.
teach. When the George Bush administration started pushing this No Child Left Behind, and we came out with these high-stakes tests, the idea was, what we were sold is that this would make schools more accountable and would increase our academic performance of kids. Now, many, many years later, you can look at the results and see clearly that it's failed to do that completely. The only thing that I can see that has been beneficial in high-stakes testing is that it's made the people who make those tests a whole bunch of money, and it's made people who make the textbooks to teach to those tests a whole bunch of money. But to the taxpayers, it's been a disaster. So I think, in fact, it's created both a hostile work environment for teachers and a hostile learning environment for kids. So what I would do is get back to the point where we allow and expect teachers to teach again.
But you don't want to have them tested. You don't want to have them evaluated.
Testing is a great point. Tests should exist as a tool for teachers to assess where a kid is, making a determination of where they need to make improvement, and then use that information to design an instructional program to move them forward. Our current system doesn't provide any of that data. It's hidden from them. Teachers are not allowed to see it. They can see scores, but they really have no idea, kid to kid, exactly what concepts have been learned and what have not. When my wife was first teaching, I think it was in the South Kitsap School District, she was working with elementary age kids, and they would do something called levels testing. So they would test the kids at the beginning, at the end of the year, I think in the middle part of the year too, I could be wrong about this, but to see what kind of progress each kid was making. So you have a group of fourth graders, for example, and you're trying to figure out, well, what level are each of my 25 kids in reading? And so they had a specific number. Well, this kid's at 2.3, second grade, third month. This kid's at 3.2, third grade, second month, and so on. So you know where that kid is. Well, then that's useful information to a teacher, because then they're able to design their curriculum for that child to get them to move forward. And one of the questions you asked is, okay, well, if a kid is way behind, what's going on here? Is it developmental? Is it nutritional? Is there some kind of learning disability that's going on, or something else? And can we address those as well? So assessments are an extremely valuable tool to teachers and to schools to help kids move forward and be successful. I would argue that our current testing regime does none of that.
What about the teacher, assessing the teacher? I mean, part of the thing that was driving some of this stuff is that they wanted to be able to, if you had a bad school or a bad teacher, it didn't seem like there was any accountability. I mean, so how do you get to that?
I wrote a couple of books on the subject of accountability and responsibility in the corporate world. And at the same time, having been a teacher, I was thinking about schools too. You don't improve businesses or schools by singling out people who are, in this case, teachers, who are not doing well and then simply firing them. Now, that being said, if we have teachers in the system who are weak, we need to move them through the system, get them out of teaching and onto something else.
The WEA will not allow that to happen.
Well, maybe currently not, but I think we could move toward a model where the WEA or the local unions, the teachers' unions, partner with the principal in each building to work with teachers to help them either make the change or move out. When I was teaching, frankly, I was appalled if there were teachers on the staff that were clearly not doing the job well.
You're right, but it just isn't going to happen. The WEA will not allow that to happen.
I understand your point of view.
Okay.
Some of it happens in your district, actually. There's a pilot in your place. They at least try.
You know, so to get back to your point, you know, we do need to hold teachers accountable, but think about this. Do people do well if you have a system that is essentially feels and looks punitive, or something that's encouraging? I prefer to encourage, and then if they're not making the kind of progress we want, then you move them out.
Yeah, I think it's not one or the other.
Yes.
I understand the jury's still kind of out because charter schools are so new in our state, but what role do you think they play in, you know, kind of this issue of raising standards, trying different ideas?
You know, the concept, you know, we voted on charter schools, we passed the charter schools at the state level. I understand that. You know, in general, I am in favor of all kinds of choices for kids. Here are my concerns with charter schools. If you look at how well charter schools have done across the nation, they're new here, okay, but in other states. In most cases, charter schools don't do any better than public schools in the same area. In fact, often not as well. There are a few outliers who do really well, but it's not even close to the majority of charter schools. Also, there are a fair number of charter schools across the country who have failed without notice and left both students and parents without really many options, trying to get themselves back into either a private school, another charter school, or a public school. And that kind of bothers me. Also, I'm concerned with any model, and not all charter schools do this, that puts making a profit above delivering the service. I don't think education ought to be about making a profit. It's about delivering education. So in general, I'm not terribly wild about the idea of charter schools.
So you're saying they're unconstitutional?
I didn't say that, but
that's what it says in the paper.
Yeah.
Then you were quoted saying, "Hell no, they're unconstitutional."
No, that was Larry Sequist who said that.
You're right.
But he has a point.
Do you agree with Mr. Sequist? How about we ask that?
Currently, it is unconstitutional. So here's the reason. School boards have elected school boards that are accountable to the people, and how they spend their money is accountable through them. Charter schools currently don't. Even the fix that the legislature made in this last run-through, I don't think addresses it. Frankly, I expect that the courts will come back and toss it.
Maybe
then what?
Maybe the better way to ask the question is, are you, if you're correct, courts toss it and we just get stuck on this thing and we can't do it, are you of the mind that, well, let's try to fix that, or unconstitutional, leave it alone, can't do it? Because you said you like some choice. I mean, it sounded like you had started your comment.
You know, the models that I like the best are the ones where the charter schools are aligning with the public school nearby, so they have both some support and accountability. And so a charter school essentially becomes very much like an alternative school, you know, in each of the districts. So there's a connection, there's accountability, we know where the money's going. That to me would make some sense. So in other words, it's almost an adjunct of the public school system. I would be okay with that, but that's not really what we're seeing in most cases. Well, I'm happy that I have the endorsement of the Sierra Club, because I'm really concerned about our water quality here. Air quality is less of an issue in the 26 because we don't really have much industrial pollution. It's mostly tailpipe pollution here. So carbon tax here, particularly if we're talking about raising gas taxes to impose a tax, I'm concerned about it because
carbon tax would not raise the gas tax.
Right.
It would increase the price of fuel, but it wouldn't be a gas tax.
Right, but yeah, that's my point. So if we're raising the price of fuel, one of the things that makes the 26 unique from, say, King County or Pierce County is that almost everybody here has to drive a fair distance to get to work. So we've got probably more commuters than there might be in other reasonably populated areas. And so when you begin to impose those kinds of taxes, again, those seem to, I think, in the 26th, disproportionately affect folks at the bottom end, the people who can least afford it. So while I am very much in favor of trying to find creative ways to get our carbon emissions down, we need to do that. to clean up Puget Sound, keep our air quality good. I'm really, I'm nervous about the way this one's written. I don't think that particular initiative is well written, frankly.
Talk about your interest in the environment. I mean, you say something about that on your website, but not a lot.
Well, I grew up here, so grew up on Puget Sound, learned to water ski, loved to snow ski. I mean, what a fabulous place to live, and it is fabulous because we have an amazing environment here. But it's also true that we've got some significant problems with degradation of those water and air. Out at Hood Canal, for example, we've got real problems out there with leaching of chemicals into the water that are causing oxygen to go down and causing fish kills. Those are things we need to be more cognizant of, work harder on, make sure that we keep those.
Do you have any specific legislation that you are in favor of or that you would propose?
Personally, I don't have any specifics for you, but I would gladly sign on. I'm listening carefully to what the Sierra Club and other environmentalists are proposing, listening carefully and saying, okay, will this help us move forward without putting terrible crimps on us? I'd like to see those happen. Public parks have not been part of our society for a really long time, but when they were introduced, I don't know, 100 years ago or whenever it was a brilliant idea. The whole idea of making nature accessible to all of us. And initially, that park system was set up without fees. So anyone, regardless of their economic situation, could go, even if they weren't able to go elsewhere, could go to a park. What we've moved toward is not just in parks, but parks are a good example of these user fees. I would argue that those user fees are really just a shift of taxes to people who can least afford them. An awful lot of folks who are using those parks tend to be middle class and below. If you're really wealthy and you have the ability to own some vacation property, that's where you're spending your time. You might have visited a park once in a while. But for the general folks who don't have a lot of disposable cash, that fee to me is a barrier. So to get to your question about parks and funding, it's another area where we have chronically underfunded, in my view, and another reason why I think we need comprehensive tax reform. We haven't made the kind of investments there on a regular basis that we should be making, and so we're constantly in a backlog just to keep up with repairs.
So just to be clear, are you in favor of dropping the parking fees?
I would be, yes.
The parking fees? I mean, the fee to go to the park.
Just got the car.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would be, yes.
If surplusing properties to help balance this thing out was an option, would you
I'd look at it.
Something like that?
I'd look at it. In general, because population tends to grow and that property tends to disappear over time, I'm reluctant to give up properties, especially beautiful properties that have a lot of potential, even if we can't afford to invest in them today. So that's not my first go-to is, okay, well, let's sell some property so we could do it elsewhere. But if it made fiscal sense and we could make some offsets elsewhere, I'd be okay with that. That, while that's not a cure-all, it's not a bad intermediate step. At least, if you match that, the methadone treatment with other support, back to my RAD example, if you provide a better environment, a place for someone who's on one of those treatment programs to succeed, including, not being with your old friends who were still in that lifestyle. So providing an environment where they have a chance to get ahead, in addition to the methadone treatment, makes sense to me.
And then Narcan, that currently the firefighters have available, first responders. Do you see expanding?
I'd love to have that tool more.
Availability?
I'd love to see that tool more widely available, especially since we're in kind of epidemic mode right now. We're seeing a lot more overdoses and having that more widely available so we can save lives that are needlessly being lost makes nothing but sense to me.
One more question on this one, and you kind of touched on it earlier when we started, but talk about the law enforcement element of this. I mean, you clearly addressed the need for treatment and that sort of stuff, getting people in there, but is the state being tough enough on this stuff? Is there somewhere where they could maybe be stronger, that would get at the root of what's going on?
Law enforcement, I'd prefer to see us focus our efforts on the dealers and the folks who are peddling the stuff rather than users. I prefer to see users moving directly to some kind of treatment program, try to intervene more quickly than put them in a prison. That's really, I don't think that's effective. Plus, if you look at both that population, folks who are drug offenders, not drug dealers, drug offenders and mental health, folks who are there for mental health, some of those are the same people. Dealing with those in our justice system, especially in police and our jails, is a very expensive way to deal with that problem. Plus, it's not effective. So I'd rather divert those funds to those treatment programs, those interventions, than to leave that on the lap of law enforcement. Frankly, they should be spending their time more on things that are really breaking the law, like dealing.
How about tougher laws against the dealers, their supplies?
I'd be all for tougher laws on dealers.
And that's right at the legislature. That's where that has to be done.
That's true.
Tough problem.
We asked your opponent. Her professional background gives her a view of the medical side of it,
Mm-hmm.
prescribing opiates, which is part of this problem too.
Sure
It's
is.
been documented. It comes from
Right.
there. And what we talked to her about was kind of a state database that monitors patients who are getting these things and allowing better access for doctors to see, oh, they've already been given this drug or something like that. Would you like to see something like that? Are you in favor of that? Do you worry about privacy at all in that?
As long as we're not violating HIPAA and we're providing that information to physicians so they can more easily see what's going on here, because people do take advantage of the system.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, I'm okay with that. I think that makes sense. If I were a physician, I'd want to know if those drugs are being prescribed by one or more other physicians. That'd be useful information. I'm thankful as a patient now when I go to a different doctor. At age 64, I have more than one, but they have the same information when I get there, and it's all updated and on a central database. Terrific. Why shouldn't we have the same kind of information available to doctors about who's using what? Yet again, transportation is a place where we've chronically underfunded. Let's take ferries to start with. You probably are aware, maybe not everybody is, that we cycle our ferries for more years than just about any other ferry system in the country or the world, as long as 50 years, which to me is crazy.
But some are 80.
Yeah, but on average, and most of those boats are built for like 30 to 40 year span. So we're not on a regular schedule for us to replace those. Now that's capital budget and that's money, but I would argue that if we did it on a more regular basis, we're always catching up, then we don't have a system that's so fragile. When a boat breaks down, we don't have a replacement, which is kind of where we find ourselves now. So I'd like to see us, and I've been meeting with the Ferry Advisory Committee on this. They've got some terrific ideas. They really know what they're talking about. So better funding for new boats, better funding for making sure that the maintenance is there, because a lot of times, again, when budgets get cut, maintenance gets cut back, doesn't turn out to be good in the long term for our system. Let's talk about the bridge for a second. This is where I'm a little upset with the Democrats, my fellow Democrats in urban areas. Most of them come from urban areas. This is more of a rural area. We've done a great job of providing support for major transportation projects in urban areas like Seattle. We've not done such a good job of providing support for people who live in places like this. So people in Bremerton and Gig Harbor are paying, I think, a disproportionately unfair share of the cost of putting up that new bridge. Did we need the new bridge? Of course we did. But we didn't have nearly the support from the state level that we should have. So there's a place where we could do better. You also know that our roads and bridges are rated C- and D+ by the, I don't know, national engineers, whatever it is, civil engineers. And, you know, so clearly we're way behind on that and need to make some investments there.
How do you feel about tolls to make those investments happen?
Oh, tolls on roads to make those investments happen?
The Narrows was the big one, obviously, and now 520, the hot lanes. It seems like our state is going that way as a user fee kind of
I'm not terribly
philosophy.
excited about it. I don't think the science supports it very well. It was interesting. I went to, way last fall, at the beginning of the session, I sat in on the Transportation Advisory Committee. So these are not legislators. These are folks who are on a committee. And their main topic that day was whether they were going to be raising the tolls on the bridge in the coming months. It was also happened to be the day that they named the part of Highway 16 for Tony Radulescu, which was kind of cool to be there and see that. But there was a guy sitting there, very patient, waiting for his chance to give his 2 minutes, which was what he was allowed in that committee. And he was pointing out the flaws in their data gathering system and their assumptions about whether or not, you know, charging to use a lane makes any kind of sense. I found his data, because I was sitting talking with him during the breaks, compelling. So I'd like to look at that a little more closely. I'm not convinced that the model that they're using now, that sliding scale fee thing, is getting the result that they want. I worked for years with a guy whose main training, his undergraduate work, was urban planning. And one of the things that he impressed on me is something I haven't forgotten. You cannot build yourself out of congestion. You can't build enough lanes, you can't build enough bridges. Because as soon as you increase capacity, volume goes up, not down. Which leads to a better solution, which is to build a more robust public transportation system and try to find ways, easier ways for people to get out of their car onto public transportation and from point A to point B with a lot less.
What would be most helpful in your district? You're not a ferry district, you're more of a roads. As far as public transportation, what would be most helpful for the folks in the 26th?
Well, to start with, if we give us our fair share of transportation dollars. I was upset that the transportation package last time was voted down by my opponent. I would have voted for it, even though it underfunded our local projects.
What projects would be most significant for the 26th?
What projects specifically in the 26th? Gosh, that's a good question. I can't give you a specific on that.
Yeah. I asked.
Other than
you're talking about
roads and
investing in
bridges.
public transportation, and in this kind of the Bremerton, obviously ferries is a major part of that.
Sure.
And then.
Well, that's part of the 26th.
Yeah, that's true. You have a slice of that.
The ferries land in the 26th.
And what about buses?
Buses, what about them? What's the question?
I mean, is that the kind, I mean, because you're saying public transportation.
Buses are by far the most economic way to move people, better than anything that's out there. Cost of dollars per passenger, they are a huge bargain.
So do we need to do more?
Absolutely. Our bus system in our area here, of course, had to get cut back after 2008 as things got tight. I'd love to see those get back to the levels where they were and expanded even further. I'd like to see greater connectivity between the buses and the foot ferries and the ferry systems in the system. No, I think I've talked about it. Number one for me is education, fully funding education, complying with McCleary, finding the funds to make sure we do that, making it more predictable and even over the years. And secondly, because if we're going to do that, we need major tax reform. Those are really the two top issues for me. I'd like to see taxes go down for the middle class, for elderly, for working poor. Those are really the things that motivate me the most. I've spent my career in jobs that were really about trying to help people. When I began as a high school choir director, My job was to try to bring kids into the arts and teach them music as a way to express themselves in ways they can't otherwise. What I learned is that those kids that were involved in the arts benefited in terms of how well they did in math and science. So really, I wouldn't bore you with the details, but so what an opportunity to serve. From the time I was in high school, I got involved in service clubs. My dad was a member of the East Bremerton Kiwanis Club at that time, and we decided to start a key club at East High School. I was the first president, so I got the bug early, and I've continued to serve in that way. I'm a member of Gig Harbor Rotary right now, the Chamber of Commerce. When I was working as a financial planner, I was involved in the Financial Planners Organization. When I was teaching, I was vice president of Washington Music Educators Association. So I'll always look for opportunities to serve and to lead. I have the skills, I have the experience to do that. My style is one that tries to bring people together, divergent points of view, and find solutions. I'm more interested in facts than I am in emotion, and try to move this state forward. I think we can solve these problems. It's just a matter of having the political will to do it, and I can do that.
Well, good. Thank you for your time. We appreciate the visit. Good luck to you.
Thanks to all of you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for being here.
Good conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.